Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of GeoPod. I'm your host, Dylan Woods. And on today's episode we are going to discuss what it is that Donald Trump wants. Donald Trump is arguably the most talked about politician we have ever seen, or at the very least we have seen in decades. The way he talks, his sometimes perceived lack of tact, his bold predictions, his hostile and standoffish behavior, all of which have been quite a subject of analyses and reactions and breakdowns, if you will, not just on YouTube but on every social media platform out there. Given the latest talks between him and President Zelensky within the Oval Office, I thought it only fitting to treat this episode of GeoPod and make it in the theme of Donald Trump, to really delve in more as to what it is and delve in deeper rather as to what it is that he actually wants. Like what is it that he wants to achieve? What is his vision? What is his ideology? And what is, let's say, the compass that he sails by? I hope to answer some of these questions in this video for you all today. So let's start off with what Trump wants before we really going to delve into his latest conversation with President Zelensky and the US-Russia bilateral talks. In my understanding, Trump wants three things. First and foremost, what Trump seems to uphold above all else is economic balance and fortuity. Donald Trump is running the United States as a business. The people he has selected and chosen to be around him says it all. Businessmen, mostly people with vast experience within the commercial world. Elon Musk obviously being the most high-profile example of all. He wants to run the United States administration as a business, meaning the sole priority of any business is economic balance, return, and prowess. And he runs the United States government as such. So rather than acting out of ethical motives, ideological motives, social motives, he seems to act primarily from economic motives. He thinks every payment should be justified economically. It should be returned. There should be something in return. Trump is not an idealist. Trump doesn't care about the affairs of this world. Trump doesn't necessarily care about the suffering of others beyond the borders of his own country. And even within the borders of his own country. What Trump seems to uphold above all else is that economic balance, that balance sheet that at the end of the day shows him that the United States is, well, for lack of a better word, a fortuitous business and is actually making profits rather than wasting money in the way he perceives it. Doge obviously stands as a great testament to that. Although I have to say that I am very much for the context of such a department. And I don't believe that should be limited just to the United States government. I think a department such as this, or rather a practice such as this, should be implemented in any other government all throughout the world, as to counter unnecessary bureaucracy, which is a blight to many governments, not just the United States government, but the governments all across the globe. So I'm not necessarily against that. And running the United States administration as a business comes with a lot of pros. It comes with an increase in accountability. It comes with an increase in efficiency in various ways and forms. However, it also comes with a lot of risks and a lot of negatives, mainly being that the political spectrum, the political machine, is so much more than a mere economic balance sheet. There are a lot of additional factors to take into account. Cultural factors, social factors, ethical factors, legal factors. Although businesses have them to a certain degree, never as vast or as extensive as within an actual political framework. So that is something that Trump seems to narrow into, right? He wants that economic return. And obviously the situation with Ukraine stands as a perfect testament to that. Okay, you're fighting a war for your own survival. First of all, you're not my neighbor. You're not even a NATO member. So tell me again, why should I care? And if I care, and if I choose to send you money, I want a return on my investment. That is how he approaches this situation. He doesn't approach this situation as the leader of the greatest nation on earth, the leader of the free world, let's say, who upholds some sort of, let's say, an ethical, moral code in regards to the geopolitical landscape. No, he doesn't see it like that. He thinks, you want my help, you can buy it. I want something in return. It's a business transaction, because that's the only world he knows. That's where he originated from. That's where he came from. So, of course, he's going to adhere to similar practices now that he's in office. We do what we are trained to do. We do what we have done most often, what we are most experienced in doing, and we tend to repeat those practices the most throughout our life. And it's nothing different with Donald Trump. So another thing that Trump seems to be very keen on, also fueled by his business past, is making deals. Trump is very set on making deals. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. I mean, making deals in many cases can be quite profitable, not just economically, but also politically, socially, morally, ethically, culturally. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. However, the perception that Trump maintains on these practices might be a bit flawed and might be a bit narrow. So let me explain to you what I mean by this. So for Trump, deals are concrete. Deals stand as a testament to progress. Trump likes to use deals as to say, look, this is what I have done. This is what I have accomplished, whereas this is where my opposition has failed. So he uses these deals, or the progress leading up to these deals, as sort of affirmations of his work. Things that he can mirror back to not just the public, but also his critics, the press and his opposition, as to show his track record, let's say, bolster his track record, and show his efficiency compared to his opposition. The problem with that being is that Trump doesn't necessarily seems interested in the kind of deals he makes. And again, the example with Ukraine stands as a big testament to this. He doesn't care about what kind of deal occurs. He just wants a deal. He wants a deal in Ukraine. So he can say, look what I have done. I've succeeded where Biden failed. I have done what nobody said I could do. So he can use it kind of like a huge tap on the shoulder for himself, and also as a sword to fend off his opposition. It's a very cunning practice. Obviously, within the political framework, and even within the business framework, the context of the deal is incredibly important, especially when it comes down to the precarious situation of Ukraine. I mean, we've had agreements with Russia. Even though Trump administration likes to make it seem that there never was an agreement and that he is the only chance at making an agreement. No, we've had countless of agreements with Russia. The latest, Minsk II, the Minsk II agreement, a terrible agreement. There have been ceasefires, there have been talks. There is nothing new here. The precarious situation here is to come up with an agreement, to come up with a deal, to come up with a ceasefire that secures the sovereignty and safeguards the sovereignty of Ukraine and stands as a huge deterrent to Russia. Obviously, Trump, at least based upon his rhetoric and behavior thus far, doesn't seem quite interested in the context of such a deal. He just wants to make a deal so he can use it as a sword to fend off his critics and opposition. And that brings me to the final thing, the final element that Trump wants safeguarded at all times. And that is, Trump wants to control the narrative. And you can tell that just by the way he talks. Trump, whenever he appears in public, is continuously campaigning. Even now that he has won the elections, he is still campaigning. Whenever there's a press conference, whenever he gives a speech, mostly it is about all the things that the Biden administration or his other parties within his opposition have done wrong and what he did right. How things never would have happened if he was in office at that certain point in time. It's all continuously sending. It's continuously besmirching the opposition, not just within the US, but abroad as well, namely Europe, and in this case, Ukraine as well. So he wants to control the narrative. Now, why does he want to do that? Well, there's a very cunning reason why he wants to do that. Because he wants to keep the resentment within his voting demographic alive. He wants to continuously remind them how false, how foul the opposition is, how he is the savior, and how he is the only path leading towards the light. It's a very cunning strategy to not just control the narrative, but to continuously fuel partisanship, where it's something that the United States is incredibly prone to, perhaps more than any other country in the world. So it's a very cunning strategy to optimize that partisanship in his favor and make sure that that resentment towards the opposition remains alive. So these are the three priorities Trump adheres to in running his administration, both nationally as well as internationally. Obviously, like I said before, many practices that Trump has installed are very favorable, are very efficient. However, he seems blinded to a myriad of other components that come along with running a political administration. And his inability or his unwillingness to immerse himself in these components is perhaps the greatest blight on his administration. And that brings me to the recent Zelensky talks. So obviously, I don't think there isn't a soul who haven't watched the joint interview with President Trump, Zelensky, and Vice President G. Vance within the Oval Office. An interview, a gathering that took a dramatic turn for the worst and ended with Zelensky and President Trump mouthing off at each other, for lack of a better word. It was perhaps one of the most embarrassing displays ever seen within the Oval Office. It was detrimental for any party involved. And right now I just want to give you my 2 cents as to what occurred, what was the background of this, some of the things I took away from it, and some of the ramifications, that this, dire turn of events might bring about. So first and foremost, the tension between Zelensky and Trump has been rising for a very long time now. It started with passive-aggressive jabs to full-on aggressive jabs at each other. I mean, Trump even ranted on Twitter, ranted on X, called Zelensky a dictator, basically placed the blame for the entire war on him, which is ridiculous. Tensions were rising. And obviously, for a very long time, Trump has his eye on the minerals and on a mineral deal with Ukraine, as to, again, brings us back to that economic balance, as to get a return for all the aid the United States has delivered to Ukraine to sustain its war effort against Russia. So first and foremost, this entire gathering was a setup. It was a setup to make Zelensky look bad, to trigger Zelensky, and to make Trump look like the big good guy, let's say. And well, it kind of worked. I think Trump believes it worked splendidly. However, the way it went about obviously was a thorn in the eye to the rest of the geopolitical community. It was an unprecedented scheme. It was embarrassing, especially because it occurred within a place, the Oval Office, that has such a historical standing within the world of politics, that has such a status, that you can't help but think that the behavior of those involved kind of besmirches the status of the Oval Office. So there are a couple of things during those talks that became apparent. First and foremost, the lack of knowledge and expertise the Trump administration has regarding historical chain of events. J.D. Vance highly exaggerated Ukraine's current position within the war. Trump and J.D. Vance both seemed very poorly informed about all the previous agreements, the previous negotiations that have been done with Russia regarding Ukraine and regarding its invasion of Ukraine. Not just its invasion of Ukraine, but also Crimea roughly 10 years prior. Always Trump seems to be in a position where he needs to be corrected. And as a leader of the free world, as a leader of, let's say, the most powerful country in the world, that isn't a good look. Whether you are pro-Trump, whether you are against Trump, it's not a good look. As a political leader, entering any negotiation, entering any kind of talks, you need to be informed. And thus far, Trump demonstrates an incredibly lack of knowledge, an incredible lack of expertise, historical expertise, also to a certain degree strategic expertise. We already know he lacks tact. We know it's not his strongest suit. He applauds himself for that, actually, because he likes, to enter the fray with his legs stretched, let's say, full on in, charge head on. And obviously sometimes that can bring about the desired results. But more often than not, it proves detrimental, not just for his own political agenda, but also for his own image, for his own status, let's say. So they went after Zelensky. They pressured Zelensky once again, in an attempt to control the narrative. They want to control the narrative. What we say is true, and what Zelensky has said to counter our arguments is simply not true. So they started talking over him. They started cutting him off. They started displaying a lack of interest, let's say, in his topics, even when he tried to respond. So this was all a setup to control the narrative and make them look like the good guys, let's say, the guys who have the truth on their side. Here is where I believe Zelensky made a fatal error, and that is he went straight into that dynamic. He copied the dynamic, he answered in the same manner. He only poured oil on the fire and just allowed it to escalate to an even higher degree after that, which is an incredibly stupid decision to make. You go to the White House knowing who Donald Trump is. You know who he is. You know his mindset. You know his weaknesses. You know his strength. You know his vulnerabilities. If you are a proper strategist, a proper politician, you know this and you adapt yourself accordingly. Zelensky should have never allowed his emotions to get the better of him. And I'm quite ambivalent to say this because I understand his reaction. His countrymen have been fighting a brave fight for years now, whereas many people, almost everybody, thought they would succumb to Russian pressure within days or at the very max 3 weeks. Yet they persevered. Not only that, but they actually pushed Russia back away from Kiev during those first months of the war. And thus far they've held their own in a very brave and very admirable manner. So I get the sentiment that Zelensky wants to defend that effort of his country. And he gets aggravated by the fact that Trump seems to live in this disinformation bubble, whereas the truth simply doesn't seem to reach his ears. He just doesn't want to accept it. He's so set in his own narrative that any additional information just gets lost on him. And that can be very frustrating, obviously, for a guy as Zelensky. But Zelensky also needs to realize that, yes, even if it's not as much as Trump claims it is, his war effort hugely depends on the United States of America. Most of the security guarantees that he wishes to achieve depend on the United States of America. So you come there knowing that you might enter one of the most important talks, one of the most important meetings during the trajectory of this war. And then to act and lose your cool in the way he did, although understandably, just is very disappointing. And is very frustrating also for the Ukrainians as well. You know, when you enter certain meetings, when you enter certain negotiations, especially knowing who Donald Trump is, you know what to expect. And you devise ways to talk around it, to talk with that, while still getting your point across. That's called political tact. And that is something that both Donald Trump as well as President Zelensky both lack severely. Zelensky has many similar attributes to Trump. Over the course of the past few years, he's entered a lot of negotiations, very standoffishly, very demanding. And to a certain degree, it has worked in his favor. But now that he stands above someone with more or less a similar bearing, whereas he is in his own home, you cannot adhere to that same approach. You cannot adhere to that same strategy. And that's, in my opinion, the fatal flaw that Zelensky made. Zelensky needs to understand that, for better or worse, this is what he needs to do for at least the next 4 years. Is it favorable? Hell no. But he needs to deal with it. His country is fighting a war for its own survival. And there was one thing Trump was right about. He doesn't hold the cards. He doesn't hold the cards. No matter how jabbing it was of Trump to say so, it is the truth. So he needs to understand that, and he needs to enter these negotiations with more tact and more emotional discipline, no matter how hard it may be, as to forward his own agenda and safeguard the interests of its own people. That being said, I like to conclude this video with some closing words. I've once said that the greatest enemy to the United States doesn't come from the outside, but it will come from the inside. And it's something that many of America's greatest enemies are very well aware of. Iran probably at the top of that. They see the growing division within the United States, the growing partisanship within the United States. And it's very pitiful to see, for a country that is so great, with so many great people, can be so much more, if it would unite more and not lose itself in division and partisanship. Trump, in my opinion, in my viewpoint, is the culmination of this development. He's the culmination of growing partisanship and growing division within the United States that have festered for years and have culminated now to a very dire point. And this is not just Trump, it's not just the Republicans. Democrats are just as much to blame here as well. They have fueled this partisanship similarly. And now we seem to be at a point where besmirching the other party seems more important than safeguarding the interest of the United States of America. The United States of America. And I fear that if this development, or if this unfortunate reality continues to develop as it does, rather than Russia, China, or Iran, that would stand as the greatest threat towards the United States hegemony and to the status of the United States as we know it today. With those words, I'd like to finish this clip. I thank you very much for taking the time to listen in. If you have any questions for me, you can leave them in the comment section down below, or you can reach out to me on one of my social media platforms, and I aim to get back at you as soon as possible. Obviously, I'll be following the developments closely, and if there's anything that piques my interest, I will surely treat it and discuss it on this channel. Once again, I thank you very much for being present. Have a blessed day, and I'll see you all again next time. Thank you.